Hello, I'm David Myers, a recently retired political science professor, and I'm one of the faculty who developed this course entitled The Emerging Powers. When we use the term emerging powers, what we're doing is recognizing the rising influence of a group of nations who've greatly increased their presence in global affairs. We're talking about states who aspire to more assertive roles on the international stage and probably more importantly possess sufficient resources that these goals are potentially achievable. In this class, we're going to look at countries such as China and India who've recently become active throughout the world, and we'll look at a number of other states such as South Africa, who've emerged as leaders not on the world scene, but certainly within their own geographic regions. Other countries, besides the three I just mentioned, who are often considered among the emerging powers, would include Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Australia, Indonesia, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. When we use the word power in a discussion of global affairs, what we're saying is that a country is willing and able to influence other countries. A world power influences countries all around the globe. A regional power influences countries within its own geographic neighborhood. And as you're going to learn in Section 2, countries, in order to be powerful, have to possess a wide range of resources. A strong military, a stable government would be both examples of these kinds of resources. And they have to be willing to use some of these resources in efforts to influence other states. In order to understand the almost revolutionary nature of the changes currently occurring in the distribution of international power, it's useful to briefly examine history, and by doing that, see how the distribution of power has changed throughout the years. Usually, we focus our attention almost exclusively on the few most powerful nations in any era. When we look back historically using this focus, we find that there are usually 3 or more states of roughly equal power at the very top or apex of the international system. When you have 3 or more states at the top of the system, you call it a multipolar system or a multipolar distribution of power. And international politics in such eras, these eras of multipolarity, is usually primarily about the conflicts and cooperation among these few nations. The last time that the world was multipolar was in the era of World War II. At that time, the great powers were the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, the United States, Italy, and China. The rest of the world was either colonies, which were not independent, or independent states, which included such potentially important places as India, Nigeria, and Indonesia, simply by being colonies, had no independent foreign policy, and thus, in terms of international politics, were virtually powerless. At the end of World War II, the international system changed from the multipolarity I mentioned a moment ago to a bipolar system. This happened because Germany and Japan, 2 of the former great powers, were defeated and were occupied countries. The United Kingdom and France remained greatly diminished from their pre-war strengths. They had suffered greatly during World War II. The United States alone ended the war stronger than ever, and the Soviet Union, although weakened by the war, was able to recover from its wartime damage, was able to maintain control of neighboring countries in Eastern Europe, and finally in 1949 ended the American nuclear weapons monopoly. With very few exceptions, the other independent countries in the world were linked in formal or informal alliances with one of the 2 superpowers. If you look at the chart, you'll notice the United Kingdom, France, and then a little bit later West Germany were joined to the United States in the NATO alliance, while another alliance treaty linked Japan to the United States. Similarly, China was allied with the Soviet Union, and the smaller states of Eastern Europe were linked through the Moscow-dominated Warsaw Treaty Organization. As almost every country was in one of these 2 great blocs, this was known as an era of tight bipolarity. Not just bipolar, but the other nations closely linked. And not surprisingly, international politics in this era was concerned with how the 2 superpowers managed their blocs, their conflicts, and occasional efforts at cooperation with each other. The few independent states that remained outside of the competing blocs, states such as India and Indonesia, were there in the system, but usually unsuccessful in their efforts, either cooperative or individual, to try to influence international events. When you got to the early 1960s, this tight bipolar world was changing. It was changing at the top level of power, but also at the lower levels of power. The United States and the Soviet Union continued to dominate international affairs, thus we still call it a bipolar era, but changes had taken place. A split had occurred between China and the Soviet Union. This meant that China was now an independent actor. Within the NATO alliance, most importantly, France, although they stayed in NATO, had removed themselves from the unified military command. What we're seeing here is the beginning of the end of the blocs. We're getting important countries such as China and France moving into independent foreign and defense policy making. China also, under Mao Zedong and more importantly under Mao's successors, worked quite successfully toward modernization and expansion of its economy, and at the same time was able to maintain firm authoritarian control and thus political stability. Another thing was happening, and that's that throughout the world, scores of colonies were coming to independence. If you look at the maps, when you look back before World War II or right after, most countries of the world, perhaps 2/3 of the world, were in the French or the British or perhaps someone else's colonial empires. In the 1960s, these countries came to independence and did not attach themselves to either the United States or the Soviet Union, but instead joined those early independent countries, India and Indonesia and others, adopting policies of non-alignment. This meant you had the possibility of new international actors pursuing their own policies. You're moving from tight bipolarity to loose bipolarity toward, ultimately, perhaps multipolarity, but we never quite got there. What happened was that after years of political turmoil, marked by a stagnant economy, a long war in Afghanistan, and a loss of foreign exchange as the price of oil fell, the Soviet Union, the other half with the United States of bipolarity, the Soviet Union collapsed, and in December of 1991 was officially dissolved. This left the United States as the sole global superpower, a superpower stronger than any possible combination of other nations. The United States was actually in a position that was unmarked, or at least unmatched, since the heights of imperial Rome. An American predominance, sometimes called American hegemony, sometimes domination even, has lasted for almost 20 years. It's become the norm in global economics, global military affairs, culture, science, political ideology, and ideals. What I'm saying is at the top of the system, we went from a two-power world to a unipolar world, really not what had been expected by most people. The other change that's taken place in the world has been at the lower levels of power. And this is the phenomena that Zakaria, who you'll be reading about in this class, what Zakaria refers to as the rise of the rest. And if you look at the charts, what you'll see is that China and India, currently the most active in the emerging powers, have now joined, if not surpassed, the traditionally important states, the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, and Japan, in that second rank of global power. In other words, we have new participants who are vitally important in international politics. And as you're going to hear as you go through this class, some people believe that China, others would add the European Union, have together already ended the period of American dominance. This rise of the rest is also seen if we step one step down at power levels, where a number of traditionally weaker countries, including countries that were colonies until the 1960s, have now become influencers not on the global scale, but within their own geographic region. If you look at the chart, again, I have 4 of them marked there. Some of the other faculty members would have added others. The point is a number of other countries who become important regional actors. And particularly I would point out that with the recent discovery of large offshore oil and gas reserves, Brazil, a large country with a thriving economy, is probably now moving up to join China and to join India, and also those traditional powers such as the British and the French, in that upper second level of the power rankings. Now, you're going to see throughout this class that the 4 of us, the 4 faculty members, have some disagreement about exactly what the distribution of power in the world today is, and particularly whether or not America remains predominant, whether or not Europeans united in the European Union or China are yet at the top of the system. But there's no disagreement among us at all that the rise of the rest continues and that it creates both new problems and new possibilities for decision makers. People today primarily focus on the problems being introduced by new countries and new powers and all the rest, and yet actually there are new problems, but also new possibilities for cooperation and other less conflictual forms of international behavior.